Hey Patreon viewers, it's Matt Easton here, and it's quite late in the month, I know, actually, for my second video, but there we go. I will get those throughout this month, don't worry. I've got one object here which I'm going to talk about. I haven't, I don't think, shown this on the public channel yet, because I've been intending to do it for a while and I haven't got round to it yet, but I thought I'd give you a little preview of it. It is an original Zulu, South African, what lots of people would call assegai, okay? But the first thing to say is this is not an assegai, so it is a short stabbing spear, definitely, okay? No question there, it's a short stabbing spear used with a large shield. But it seems that this was usually called the Iklwa, okay? In most books you'll read that that's because that's the sound it makes when it either goes into or out of an opponent. I don't know whether this is really true or not, but it sounds fun in a weird kind of way. The assegai, as I understand it, is more of a general word for spear in South Africa, in amongst Zulu anyway, for probably more for the throwing spear, for the long spear. It seems like this particularly short stabbing spear, which according to legend, was pioneered by Shaka Zulu, who was essentially a sort of, he's the sort of Alexander the Great of the Zulu Empire. So for those of you who don't know, the Zulus essentially were one group of people who were or let's say one kingdom, really, one kingdom of people who were living in South Africa in the 18th century and well, early 19th century by the time Shaka comes along. And essentially Shaka came along and kind of consolidated this empire, became king, and went through a period of expansion. And there were other people, there were other groups, other nations living in South Africa, and they were essentially conquered or absorbed or killed off by the Zulu. So the Zulu were a conquering nation, and really kind of Shaka was seen as their founding father. In fact, it was a series of kings who seems to have built up the Zulu Empire into what it became later, and the reason why everybody's heard of Zulus now rather than all of the other thousands of tribes all over Africa. The Zulu are very, very famous because, of course, they came into conflict with the Boers, who were mostly Dutch settlers. Not only Dutch, incidentally, some of the Boers were German and even Huguenot French and Swedish even. But the Zulus came into conflict with the Boer settlers, essentially white settlers, but also they came into conflict, famously so, as featured in the film Zulu, with the British forces, with the British Army. Not just in the 1870s, not just in 1879 incidentally, there were several run-ins between the British and the Zulus over a number of decades. And even after the 1879, sort of the famous Zulu Wars, there were continued conflicts which led up to what the British Empire was seen as insurrections. But of course, you know, there's 2 or 3 or 4 sides to every kind of bit of history. But 1879 was when the Zulu War, let's say 1879 to 1880, was what we call the Zulu War. So if you look at the movies Zulu and Zulu Dawn, then that's set during 1879. Only 1 year really, but a series of battles were fought during 1879. 1880 were kind of mopping up operations, which essentially brought the Zulu Empire under the heel of the British government. So this weapon is a short stabbing spear, definitely known as an Iklwa, but really the one thing I really wanted to say about it, because obviously this is a relatively short video, I'll do a more in-depth video on this at some point, is that whilst this is a spear, it fulfills the same kind of function, the same technical function as something like a gladius or a Bronze Age leaf-bladed sword, and that is, it is designed to be used exclusively. I mean, it doesn't have to be, but it's designed to be used exclusively with a large shield. And a lot of time when people ask me about the gladius, for example, or indeed the assegai, as most people call it, or the Iklwa, they're comparing this as a solo object with another solo object, like a British cavalry sword or a sort of Germanic long-bladed sword, Sparta type thing, or whatever, you know. So we can't, if for example someone said to me, oh Matt, can you compare the gladius with the katana? Okay, it's a completely bizarre comparison because you have to include the large scutum with the gladius. You need to include the large shield with it. And that's exactly the same with the Zulu spear. It only makes sense being a short spear because it's used in one hand as a stabbing, you could say sometimes cutting, but mostly stabbing implement, to be used alongside the large shield. And the large shield is as much of an important weapon. You could even argue a more important part of the armament overall as the actual spear is itself. So when we talk about spears, like if I talk about spears versus swords, I'm usually talking about long spears, normal length spears, and usually not used with a shield. As soon as we bring a shield into it, it completely changes the nature of things. And I often talk about the length of weapons and how reach is a massive advantage. But with shields, they're like the trump card that ruins that equation. Okay, so if someone's got a long spear and a shield, and you come along with a short spear and a shield, you're not at an inherent disadvantage because you've got a large shield. And certainly in HEMA we tend to focus on weapons without shields. We don't have many shield sources, but we tend to focus on at most sword and buckler or rapier and dagger, but aside from that it's usually things like longsword, saber, mesa, you know, single spear, this kind of thing. And in those scenarios, the longer reach is definitely a big advantage. As soon as you bring shields into it, it changes it all. So I'm going to wrap it up there, but really just to say that the Iklwa, sometimes known as an assegai, is a short spear and should almost be compared more with short swords than necessarily with long spears. Hope that's been somewhat interesting, and I'll see you for the next video. Cheers, folks!